Good morning. I'm here representing the Department of Buildings in this presentation on EnergyStar Portfolio Manager, property types, local law 97. Everything that we're going to talk about today, I was one of the representatives for the building department in the work that we're going to cover with EnergyStar Portfolio Manager. So it's an honor to provide this presentation to you all and to make sure that we cover certain key things today. All right, so some logistics. This is approved for AIA continuing education. You can see the info right here. Okay, now this, here's some more logistics. So, please read at your own pace. Okay, so this, I'm going to read a statement to you. It's not what you see here, but this is just to know that this meeting is recorded, by the way. Just wanted everyone to be aware of that. And to be eligible for continuing education credit, attendance is required throughout the entire duration of the presentation and will be tracked. Following this course presentation, learners who meet attendance requirements will receive an email from Building Events at buildings.nyc.gov with a link to a course evaluation form. Once the form is received, it needs to be submitted within 24 hours. Additionally, learners who have met the attendance requirements and have requested a certificate of completion will receive it via an email from Building Events at buildings.nyc.gov. Emails will be sent to the email address provided upon registration. Okay, so got that out of the way. So, here's the basic agenda. There's some ground rules, the course description, and the learning objectives. So in essence, more logistics. We'll talk about the basics of local law 97. That's the foundational things that it's always important to remember. I would say when thinking about this, because it sets the big picture, and that will help orient what we're doing and why and all of that. After that, we'll talk about the conversion process to EnergyStar Portfolio Manager and the EnergyStar Portfolio Manager property types. We'll get into some example calculations that will build on top of each other. Then we're going to step back for a bit and talk about the effects of this conversion, meaning the effects on the covered buildings that are under the law, just to give a sense of what happened under the conversion. Then we're going to do a case study that builds on the examples from earlier. Then I'll give you a brief overview of the outreach that we've done and some resources and questions. So there'll be time for questions at the end. There'll also be a pause at some point where I'll answer a few questions, and in the chat, members of the department will be answering questions as well. So please send your questions. All right, so here are the ground rules. During the training, attendance is monitored. Everyone is muted to minimize the background noise. As I mentioned, this presentation is being recorded, and this is what I was saying just before, questions answered via the chat, some during and at the end. And afterwards, just a reminder, again, submit your course evaluation form. Okay, here's the course description. I'll just read it. Probably you could read it faster than I'll say it, but I'll just read it to be sure. This course presents an overview of EnergyStar Portfolio Manager property types as they pertain to Local Law 97 of 2019, Building Energy and Emissions Limits. Also covered are the basic components of Local Law 97 with emphasis on emissions limits and including how property types may be selected for buildings covered under the law. Okay, the learning objectives. At the end of this course, you'll be able to learn about the compliance reporting under Local Law 97 and be able to explain how this law will help achieve greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals. We'll learn about the process of mapping, which will say conversion from here on out. So the conversion or mapping, a conversion to EnergyStar Portfolio Manager property types as it pertains to Local Law 97 building energy and emissions limits. We'll review the components of building emissions reduction law, Local Law 97, including how buildings identify their property types and how emissions limits are calculated. And lastly, we'll discuss how using EnergyStar Portfolio Manager property types may affect compliance under Local Law 97, building energy and emissions limits. Okay, so we're going to get started with some of the basics. Okay, so foundational things, always good to keep in mind when we're just with Local Law 97, right? So, I mean, really, who does it affect? Well, it affects most buildings over 25,000 square feet. That's about 27,000 BBLs, and a BBL is a property. BBL stands for building block lots, but 27,000 BBLs actually can represent many more buildings. As you can see, the number here, 48,000 buildings, because more than one building can be on a BBL. So, keep that in mind. 48,000 buildings, approximately. That represents 60% of the gross floor area of the city of New York. So with just 48,000, and no one's saying 48,000 is a small number, but 48,000 of about 1.1 million buildings in New York, 48,000 under this law, under Local Law 97, is 60% of the floor area. So it's a huge impact. So that's what the law covers. The covered buildings list has these BBLs. That is on our website. The link will be at the end. And the covered building list, definition is basically as such, with some exceptions, that buildings that exceed 25,000 square feet, two or more buildings on the same tax lot that together exceed 50,000 square feet, two or more condominium buildings governed by the same board of managers and that together exceed 50,000 square feet. So this definition, besides covering the 48,000 buildings, also includes a prescriptive pathway for certain affordable housing. We're not going to talk about that today. That information, though, about the Article 3, which is under Article 321. So just to draw the distinction, we're focusing on where Local Law 97 amended the administrative code, Article 320. And I'll say that over and over again, but Article 320 is what we're talking about today. So check our website. We'll provide those links at the end so you could see this detail yourself. So anyway, who does this affect? Well, we just talked about the buildings. Well, owners need to then do what? Well, they need to work with a registered design professional, an RDP, someone with their registered architect or someone with their professional engineering license to prepare the submission on behalf of the owner about the building's information, its energy use, and its greenhouse gas emissions. When does that come into play? It starts May 1st, 2025, reporting for the 2024 period, so 2024 year. So that's the first year that your building's performance will count towards this compliance. So that's obviously coming up. So that's important to keep this time in mind, and we're going to talk more about the timeline coming up next. But why all of this? I think I always think about the big picture goals. As I said, it always helps me. We have an 80 by 50 goal, and what is that? Well, you could see it written out here. It's an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2050. Now that's based on a 2005 baseline. And that's obviously 80% by 80 by 50, right? 80% by 50 is a large amount. And buildings in particular, represent a huge proportion of the emissions in our city. So 68% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from the way and we use our buildings, the energy use of our buildings. So with the 48,000 buildings under our covered buildings list, we're actually impacting 40% of the carbon of our buildings. So 40% of the 68%, which is, for simple math, is just under 30%. So under this law, there's a tremendous opportunity and responsibility to make our city more sustainable, more resilient by reducing our emissions, by getting ourselves on the path to where we need to be as a society. So I think it's always important. I always think it's important because I always want to think of the big picture and know it so that I can understand, what are the connecting pieces. So we're going to get into that, and that's the purpose of the details we'll get into today. It's a component of what submissions are about, which is understanding how to calculate your building's emissions limits. Now, just to, as I alluded to, there's a timeline, all right? We want everyone to be aware. The law became effective in the fall of 2019, was passed in the spring. An advisory board was formed. they were part of providing recommendations to the department. It helped inform an advisory board report, which was just released. It's on our website. I'll mention that again. There's also very important and the subject of this discussion today, a Rule 103-14, emissions limits and GHG coefficients. A large portion of what we're talking about today is in the rule. So for the most part, as I mentioned, Article 320, the Administrative Code, Article 320 is a bulk of what we'll speak about, as well as Rule 103-14. So the source materials, details on procedures and components and the requirements of the law are in these two places. And I'll say that over and over again. And there's links to all of this on our website, and there will be links at the end to point all of this out. But anyway, back to the time frame. There's further rulemaking coming up this year, as well as the first compliance period, 2024 to 2029. So that's just a reminder that 2024 is the first year that counts. And this first compliance period is a 6-year period, whereas the second compliance period is 2030 to 34, which is a 5-year period. And then not shown on here, this is not to scale. The third period is 2035 to 39. Then it's 2040 to 2049, so that's a 10-year period. And finally, we get to 2050. And here it says carbon neutral, so that's not a mistake. So this is just understanding that even though there are the city goals of 80 by 50, society, the city, the International Panel on Climate Change, the United Nations, we all, are in agreement of the need to have a carbon neutral society by 2050. So I'll, in essence, say things about 2050 and almost talk interchangeably about 80 by 50 and carbon neutral, but just be clear, the goal is carbon neutrality for our buildings, and that's represented in the Rule 103-14. You'll see the limits that are published are bringing our buildings to a carbon neutral point. So just keep that in mind when we're going through this today. All right. So just to give some background of some key concepts and methodologies that were carried out to set forth what you saw on the previous two slides, meaning things had to be calculated, figured out to get us under this this end goal, if you will. And a big component of that is the benchmarking data for Local Law 84 of 2009, which we've had data now for about 12 years have been collected. So that was foundational. The mayor's office worked on calculations that you see in Article 320, and the building department and the mayor's office of climate and environmental justice, we worked together on the process to convert to the EnergyStar Portfolio Manager property types, which we'll be talking about in detail coming up. But just to be clear, we at the department, in the conjunction with the mayor's office, worked on maintaining all the methodologies and the intent of the law as it was originally described and what is in the rule that provides further guidance. And that is to say that we chart a path to the 80 by 50 using the 2005 baseline, and a building categorization system was selected. In Article 320, it's the building code occupancy type, and we'll talk a little bit about that, but then we'll talk about the EnergyStar Portfolio Manager property types categorization system. Now, to be clear with the timelines, this first compliance period is in essence a warm-up, meaning it is not on the path to the 80 by 50 or carbon neutral, whereas the second compliance period, 2030 to 34, gets us closer to that path to 80 by 50. So if you just imagine the trajectory from the 2005 baseline to the year 2050, this first period coming up is above that trajectory, if you will, and that the second compliance period gets us closer to that trajectory. And then as we go forward in the future, we continue to get closer and closer to the end goal. So that's just a way to orient and understand the limits that we're talking about. We're focusing on the first compliance period today and the process. The Rule 103-14 publishes the limits for the future compliance periods. Okay, so this is what I was pointing out with Article 320. So you can see the reference right there, 28-320.3.1. It's in the administrative code, and here it stipulates the department shall provide a method for converting categories of uses under the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency Portfolio Manager tool to the equivalent uses. So we'll say a lot of shorthand around the the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency Portfolio Manager. It's what we will say EnergyStar Portfolio Manager. We have a lot of abbreviation where it says ESPM. So ESPM is what this is, and it's the method for converting to equivalent uses based on performance. So that is the benefit of this conversion in a nutshell. It's based on equivalent uses, and it provides energy as the energy and emissions as the basis for the categorization system. And now, once again, the rule 103.14, just to point out terminology, because we're going to use terminology that is different for similar endpoints. And what I mean by that is in the Article 320, there is a term building emissions intensity limit. And in the rule, there's a term emissions factor. When we say building emissions intensity limit, we're focusing on what Article 320 has, which is the category system of building codes occupancy type. When we speak of emissions factor, we're talking about the EnergyStar Portfolio Manager property types. And if that's not clear, we're going to keep going over it, and there'll be plenty of examples to really point out what we're talking about. So as I mentioned, these are Article 320 and the rule are the two places to go. And the links will be, the links are on our website and they will be at the end. So you'll have plenty of ways to get to this information. Okay, so Article 320, the first compliance period, 2024 to 2029, is what you see represented in this table. And here underlined building emissions intensity limit. The shorthand that we often use is in this document and in the guide documents is GHGI limit, greenhouse gas intensity limit. The units of measure are there, tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per square foot. And building emissions intensity limit is referring to the GHGI limit, in that those are the units. And later on, when we are talking about emissions factor, it is also in tons of carbon equivalent per square foot. So that's what I was talking about. So just, hopefully the jargon doesn't trip you up. You'll see it referenced, and it's to orient you to the building categorization system we're speaking of. So here, once again, on the left-hand side, you see it says 1 through 10. We refer to those as the limit groups. And in the middle, you could see the building code occupancy type. For example, A, assembly, B, business. All of that is in the descriptions of what the building code occupancy type, what the requirements are. It's all in the building code, chapter 3. And then it'll provide the description of that. And then, but in Article 320, you can see these are the 10 limits all the way on the right-hand side. So these are the 10 values that are the limits in the building code categorization system, and in the EnergyStar property types that we'll talk about in detail coming up. The property types, of which there are 60 that are in our documentation, are using these 10 limits in this first compliance period. In the rule 103.14, there are the limits going forward into the future, where there are not just 10 in the first period, there are 60 individual limits, emissions factors under the EnergyStar property type system. So this is just some foundational information about what's in the law, and just to get us a baseline. Now, before we get into the discussion on the conversion process and the EnergyStar property types, I'm just going to go through a few questions and answer them right live. And so question 1, why was this conversion necessary? Why didn't the law start with the EnergyStar property types? As written by City Council, Local Law 97 called for a transition from limits based on building code occupancy to the EnergyStar property types. And this change more accurately reflects the amount of emissions generated by different property types. And will help the city, us at the city, establish fairer and more equitable emissions limits. So that's why it was written in Article 320. And so That's what this conversion process is about. Second question, does the DOB plan to continue to revise the conversion from the building code occupancy groups to the EnergyStar property types? Well, we'll continue to work closely with our partners at EnergyStar to ensure that we're properly characterizing all the possible property types of the local law 97 covered buildings. Question, the next one. So how were the advisory board members chosen? The advisory board was chaired by our DOB Chief Sustainability Officer, Gina Bokra, and was comprised of 16 appointees with 8 appointments made by the mayor and 8 by the city council. And the result of that work is on our website. The advisory board report, the members of the advisory board are listed on our website, so that is all there, the report, the information about who was involved. Okay, so last question. So where can one find the advisory board report? Well, I already said that. The links are to the report are on our Sustainable Buildings website, which the link is at the end, and on the DOB Local Law 97 website. So those links will be at the end, and there's all the information there. Okay, so hopefully that is helpful, and it reinforces certain points as well as illuminates some other things. And now we're going to get into the conversion process and talk about the EnergyStar property types. So hopefully all the background, the background is setting us up for this part. And there's a lot of words here on this slide, and this information here doesn't do justice to the process that was undertaken. Me as a member of the department working with the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice, there was a lot of iterations, there was a lot of work, but it's always important to point out that we maintained the expected emissions reductions for the building sector from the Article 320 categorization system of building code to now the categorization system of EnergyStar. The same expected emissions reductions for the building sector is in place, and the path, the trajectory to the 2050 time was able, that was the calculating sort of endpoint factor for everything we did. And that's why we always want to point out, where we're going with this and the needs of our city and our society when we talk about these limits. The details of the report are in a peer-reviewed report on our website, the methodology. Please take a look. The link is here, and it's on our website. I think it's interesting. Of course, I mean of course I'll say that I was part of it, but I think we took it. It's very important. We take it very seriously, what the stakes are, and it's important to just recognize that by doing this conversion, we're aligning our emissions limits with the property types in EnergyStar, which is one. It's been around as a national system for many years. And as well as it's been fundamental to the New York City reporting on annual benchmarking, Local Law 84, and the energy grading, Local Law 95 of 2016. And you can, see things in, these bubbles here, like just describing baselining and modeling and converting and analyzing the impact and on all of that. And you could read about those details in the methodology report. But and it may be more, maybe this is helpful, but a more mathematical way of looking at it is, we had to calculate using, the local 84 data of the past few years. We used several years of comparison, but focused on 2018 data. You could read all about it in the report. And we had to calculate using the covered buildings list available and the energy available in the local 84 data to calculate emissions intensities, expected emissions reductions, to baseline it and then match between the two categorization systems. We set up an initial percentile of where one of those 10 GHGI limits, building intensity limits, would be set, and then we calculated the emissions reductions between the systems. And we then revised the percentiles based on the overall goal of the law, getting us, in that warm-up period to the path to the 80 by 50, or actually carbon neutral now. But we revised those percentiles to make it more equitable and fair within each property type, meaning that buildings were converted based on equivalence. So therefore, it allowed for performance-based assignment of your limit. And then the result is a table of the 60 EnergyStar Portfolio Manager property types assigned one of those 10 GHGI limits or emissions factors. Those 60 property types, that's it's in our rule 103.14, and it's in a reference guide that is on our website, which we're going to talk about, and you'll see screenshots from that reference guide. And just be aware, in the reference guide, it's the first compliance period, but in the rule, you'll see the emissions factors for future compliance periods, all the way up to the last one. Okay, so hopefully this illuminates things, and if not, please look at the report on our website. Okay, now we're going to talk about EnergyStar Portfolio Manager's property types. Please take a look at this link at your leisure. I'm going to walk us through one example, but there are many things to look at here. There's over 85 property types on the website at this current time, and you need to spend time, or a registered design professional, your owners, you may want to look at this depending on your level of interest, but you can see more details. So I'm going to just use a generic example that we'll build upon in the examples coming up. And so if you have a drugstore on the first floor, I don't think the first thing you think of necessarily, maybe it's just me, I don't necessarily think of it as retail, but if you go to these category groups here and click on retail, the first floor drugstore is one of these property types shown here. And if you click on retail store, you can see the glossary definition, and here it is, the retail store. It says a lot, it gives a lot of examples, but one of them is drugstores. All the way on the right-hand side, it says drugstores. So this, ground floor drugstore is a retail store. So when looking at this glossary, you could figure out, and then if you go to the glossary page, and the links are here, and you can Google the site to find it, because us at DOB, we're referencing this EnergyStar materials, but since this is not our information, our website, it's subject to change. And if you believe that your building includes a property type that is not listed on our 60 property types in our materials, then please contact us at our email. I'll provide the email over and over again. You'll see it on the screen. But our email, the sustainability team, is ghgemissions@buildings.nyc.gov. So here's how we're selected this property type. So now we know how to select the property type. Retail store is drugstore. Okay. And once again, please explore this on your own and look at the glossary. There's a lot of definitions there. Okay, so we're going to get a little bit further into an example about emissions factors with EnergyStar. This table here is an excerpt of what is in our reference guide. It's table 2.1. This table has the 60 EnergyStar property types for the first compliance period listed alphabetically. You can see, a retail store right here. So this is our drugstore. And you don't worry about the information in the middle at this point, but that's, the information under building code. We're going to focus on what's on the right, the emissions factor for the first compliance period. And so a retail store, our drugstore, has a factor of 0.00758 tons of CO2 per square foot. Okay, so we figured out our property type by going to the EnergyStar glossary. Now we can go to the reference guide, table 2.1, and we can look up what retail store is, and here it is. So that's step 1 and 2. Now, also, before we even get too far down, the rest of the calculations, it's important to understand, and this is in our reference guide, that covered buildings need to assign per the descriptions in the property type section of EnergyStar Portfolio Manager's glossary. And every space used on every floor in the building must be assigned to a property type. And you can see here where ancillary spaces, including but not limited to shafts, stairwells, or egress paths, mechanical spaces, and incidental uses are associated with a single building use, they should be assigned that property type. Where ancillary spaces serve multiple building uses, the ancillary space should be prorated and assigned proportionally across the different property types in a building. So just keep this in mind when you're selecting your property types, that you have to assign them to every use in your building. Sorry. And just once again, to be very clear, this is really saying a component of what we just looked at. A single use gets a single property type, and multiple uses get multiple property types. Okay, more definitions, right? Setting ourselves up for calculations. Gross floor area, very important that it's the total area in square feet of all the floors and spaces in a covered building as measured between the exterior surfaces of the enclosing fixed walls. The gross floor area includes the vent shafts, elevator shafts, flues, pipe shafts, vertical ducts, stairwells, light wells, basement space, mechanical electrical rooms, and interior parking. And it does not include unroofed courtyards or unroofed light wells. For atria, use only the gross floor area that includes the floor of the atrium. And for the purposes of calculating gross floor area in tenant spaces, the interior demising walls should be measured to the center line of the wall. Now, this is in our reference guide. This definition is important to once you select your property types, you need to have assign it its gross floor area. And here's the definition and description. It's in our reference guide. And this is an important definition to make sure you understand all the details. So just to recap, we reviewed a bunch of definitions. We went through the EnergyStar property types using the EnergyStar glossary. We talked about single use or multiple uses in a building, the emissions factor, selecting it from the table in the reference guide, and gross floor area. So these are necessary components for the calculations that we're going to be doing. And before we do that, I want to point out again the rule 103-14, which is called Requirements for Reporting Annual Greenhouse Gas Emissions for Covered Buildings. We'll show many of the details and the definitions. We'll show all of the definitions we just spoke about. And there's also much more in there about requirements for submission. Different types of factors, coefficients, calculations, etc. are shown in there. So please take a look. So Rule 103.14 is where much of this information exists, and the other place it exists is in Article 320. So I'll say that over and over again because it's very important. Please take a look. RDPs, please become very familiar with these documents. It'll help clear up many of the things that you may be wondering about. So enough of that, I guess. Selling our rule, making sure you know where it is. So making sure the location is clear. That link is also at the end, and it's on our website. So this is just pointing out the definition as it's described in the rule, with the variables in the rule about single building use, a single occupancy group, or property type. So here we're using the terminology of both categorization systems. And this is just stating the same concept and in essence, single use, single categorization. And then it's the gross floor area multiplied by the emissions factor. And building on that concept, of course, is the multiple use, multiple occupancy groups or property types. Now it's the same idea, same math in essence, and you just calculate the values and sum them. And these are the variables that are listed in the rule. You could see it here. This is the equation 103.14.1, and here is the calculation. Your building's emissions limit for the covered building with multiple occupancy groups here. You see the summation of the product of the emissions factor times the gross floor area. So emissions factor of that property type times the gross floor area of that property type summed is your building's emissions limit. And now we're going to go through those examples coming up. So if this is a bit challenging to follow, we're going to do a lot of examples. That's why we're building up all these foundational definitions around these terms, around where you can find the information to define these terms, and so on. So here we are with our example. We're building off the same example in essence. We have residential apartments. a drugstore, and a supermarket. So this is that first floor drugstore. And what is it? Well, in property types in EnergyStar, you go to the glossary and you find residential apartments or multifamily housing. Probably obvious. Retail store is drugstore. That would take a little time reading the glossary to find that. You can go to the glossary and search the term drugstore, and you'd find it under retail. And supermarket is supermarket. And you can see the table here, the table 2.1, where the property types are listed alphabetically. And this is just an excerpt. Of course, we're going to just pull the values here, right? We're selecting them because we've defined our property types. We know because we know our uses. And here are the limits. You can see the 3 limits for our building, the emissions factors, I should say, and that's why that terminology is important, is a distinction. Emissions intensity limit is for the building code, and we'll talk about that later. That's in the middle of the table, and on the right, emissions factor. That's the focus of the calculations for now. Okay, so now we need some floor areas, right? So this is why we went through the gross floor area definition. This multifamily housing, this mixed use building, which is primarily multifamily, is 115,000 square feet. You can see that here. And this is just another way of saying that accounting for all the uses of your building is important. And here you can see that, and this is based on a real building, actually. So it's not made up. I don't know if that makes you feel better or not, but just so you know. And there's more than in our reference guide, which is linked here and linked at the end. There's several examples. There's 3 types of examples and 3 case studies. We'll just talk about one today. This is what we're talking about, and this is pulled from our reference guide. These visuals, these examples, and you can see the calculation, right? So I mentioned floor area, 90,000 square feet is the multifamily. You pull the emissions factor off the table we just looked at, you multiply it, you get a value 608 here, and you just do it again, and you could see the limit at the bottom, right? 1,040 is the total building emissions limit. So this is this building's emissions limit. So for that 2024 compliance period, this is the limit that they have from 2024 to 2029, 1,040. So that should be clear. And now we're going to step back. So what we're, we just went through a lot of definitions. We went through calculation, but the implications of this conversion and this calculation is that things will have changed. Potentially, depends on your building. Your results will vary, and so we're going to get into some details, some big picture things about what this conversion did to our buildings, covered buildings list. Okay, so this is in our reference guide. This is to just note that owners, where your buildings, your emissions limit may have been lowered, made more stringent by this conversion, you have the option of following either of the systems, either the original limits based on the New York City Building Code occupancy groups, which is in Chapter 3 of the Building Code, or and Article 320, or the limits based on EnergyStar property types, which is in our rule, for calendar years 2024 and 2025. Beginning in 2026, all owners must use the limits based on the EnergyStar property types. So this is in essence a grace period, or a period of time where owners, you can, and working with your RDPs, can calculate your building's emissions limits as the building code occupancy group categorization system works out for your calculations. And we're going to go through the case study which will really make that distinction. But if your total building's emissions limit has been made more stringent by this conversion to EnergyStar, you can use the building code calculation. So just keep that in mind, that if your limit was made more stringent under the conversion, you can use the building code system. And we're going to go over what that looks like. That's why that table 2.1 that we've been looking at shows those values on it. Once you identify your use, you reference the intensity limit or the emissions factor. And once again, if you believe your building includes a property type that is not listed, please contact us at the DOB Sustainability Team at our email here, ghgemissions@buildings.nyc.gov. It'll also be at the end. And any questions you may have that we don't get to today, please email us. Okay, so the effects of the conversion, right? So the effects may have changed a property's limits, may have changed compliance status, and may have changed any potential penalties. And we say may and potential for a reason is that it's a condition of the building information as reported. So we compared this conversion using the building code system, and we then converted to the equivalent uses of EnergyStar property type, and things may have changed. And your individual building and properties will vary, may vary. It's why you need your RDP to look at this for you and help work through those calculations. And on a limit basis for the properties in our data set, and this is summary information of what is described in our methodology report, although there's not a visual just like this, but the information is based on what's in that report. Limits have changed, but the vast majority, the limits have not changed at all. You can see 71%, and some increase and some decrease. More reassuring, I would say, is that compliance has not changed for over 97% of our properties. And you can see the smaller percentages up above where compliance switched from compliant to non-compliant. So maybe this is reassuring or maybe it's not. It depends on your situation, of course, and that's why if you're not sure, work with an RDP. There's also, we're going to very briefly at the end just point out resources to help wrap your head around the compliance situation potentially. But once again, an RDP is submitting to the department to us. So an RDP ultimately needs to be responsible for assessing your building's property types, floor area, et cetera, the things that we had just talked about. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the case study. It builds on everything we talked about. So no surprises here, I would say. Well, I don't think there are surprises. You can judge for yourself. And we're gonna get into the building code categorization system, those calculations for the building emissions limit, and then the calculations for under the EnergyStar Portfolio Manager system. Look at our reference guide. There's 3 case studies here. We're just going to briefly review one, but it does illustrate, the major concepts to be aware of with your actual property, with your actual buildings. Okay, so here's our building, based on a real building. It's this mixed use building, and you can see 2 tables broken out. It's showing what we had across horizontally on that table 2.1. I keep talking about, rental apartments, drugstore, and supermarket. Well, rental apartments in the building code is R2, and drugstore and supermarket are both in the building code group M, which is mercantile. And you could see they had then all the way on the right-hand side or inside the hatched markings, you could see that they have the same building emissions intensity limit, the 0.01181. So sorry, I needed to press that before. And here we go. So that's the, under the Article 320.3.1, there's those items 1 through 10, those 10 limit groups. It points this out, and that's why I keep pointing out Article 320 shows the limits as it relates to building code with these building emissions intensity limits, but the rule has the emissions factor that shows the property types matching up with the emissions factor. And then our guide also breaks it out and provides the examples. So that's the, here we are with our drugstore. It's this value here. That's the emissions intensity limit, tons of carbon per square foot. And here's our drugstore. You can see this is the retail. It's limit, under section 320.3.1, it's item number 3. So that's a different limit. It's 0.00758. We looked at up before in that table 2.1. It's those values all the way on the right-hand side of the table. And that just shows, here you can see it all together. And the last use of our building is this one, supermarket, mercantile, same number as the drugstore here. And you can see, though, it changes significantly under the EnergyStar property type. So the conversion to equivalent uses has made supermarkets limits higher. Uh, that should, help point out the improved fairness and equity in this conversion, and that's something we are very proud of, and that's why the methodology report will, go through details of those calculations, and it's something that was a very rigorous process to make sure that all the values were mapped, converted appropriately. Okay, so here's everything all at once. Hopefully, since you've seen these numbers before, it's not overwhelming. You could see the building code system, it's highlighted in gray and that's sort of to the left. And it's our three uses, our mixed use building. We have our, everything here. We're going to, the calculations are there, but, go skip ahead if you must, but I'm going to walk through all these numbers just to make sure it's very clear. These calculations for building emissions limits. So we have our aggregate gross floor area, so all the uses. This is our real building, the 115,000 square foot mixed use building. And all the uses are accounted for here. Once again, just pointing out why it's important to assign a property type to all of your building's uses. So 115, 115. And we won't talk about this today, and I just briefly mentioned it, but the building's emissions, actual emissions. So it's 2024 performance for this case study. Obviously it's not 2024 yet. So we just using the energy use in buildings, the utility bills, multiplied by emissions coefficients, we get this number, 1,035. So we're not going over that today. So this is something, is in other reference material, and there'll be future guidance on more details, but also just calculating emissions from energy is also in the rule 103-14. So you could see the formulas there if this is not something you're familiar with. So our example building here has the total annual building emissions of 1,035. And then when we do the calculations, the 90,000 times the building emissions intensity limit, we get the same, 608 number we looked at. You could see the other three numbers are there. It equals 903. And that is the annual building emissions limit, 903, using the building code categorization system. Its limit is 903, but its actual emissions is 1,035. You could see that its limit is lower than the actual emissions. So is this building compliant for the 2024-29 period? No, it's not. That doesn't mean this building wouldn't be compliant in the future years of this compliance period, because that's a thing that you would want to look at once you do these calculations for yourself and see where you are with the help of your RDP, and see what kind of operational or capital or both measures can be implemented to help you get below your limit. So this is this building's limit under the building code, as it is in Article 320. Now here it is all at once, using the EnergyStar property type. So we already saw these values, the 0.0675, the retail store, the grocery, supermarket. You can see that here, same calculation. Your rental apartments it's 90,000 square feet times the same emissions factor equals 608, and you could see the rest of the numbers calculated here for a total of 1,040. So now this building's emissions limit, this annual building emissions limit is 1,040. So now it's just above this building's actual limits. So this building is now compliant, right? So, you can see the math here. And this is why that 2-year grace period is important to understand. This is the sort of calculation we're talking about. If when your RDP calculates the limit under the building code system, like what you see in the gray towards the middle, and that limit is higher than the EnergyStar limit, building emissions limit calculation, what you see in the blue on the right, then you can use the emissions intensity limits in that table 2.1, which are in the center. So in that reference guide, and the reference guide will explain it and say it over and over again. The grace period is there. These examples, the case study, and 2 others are there, and there's more detail. But this is the implication. So if your building code emissions limit is now is the higher one, then you can use that for those 2 years. So that's a calculation you'll want your RDP to do, so you could see where you are and get ready for that May 1st, 2025 first submission deadline, because the 2024 performance is obviously just coming. It's coming up fast. And here's saying something that hopefully is pretty clear with these limits, how the building emissions intensity limit, and then the EnergyStar property types, the emissions factor, how those numbers change. You saw that in the previous table. Supermarket is much higher now. It's more than double compared to when it was in the building code using the mercantile. And that's why, I should have mentioned this earlier, but the building code occupancy group classification system is oriented around fire code, life and health and safety matters, and that's all described in Chapter 3 of the Building Code. So this conversion to equivalent uses is an important step to assigning the performance and the limits of a building according to the performance as we've been able to calculate in our data set, which is, once again, it's in that methodology report. So anyway, probably saying this enough times by now, because really, there's a lot of outreach and there's a lot of resources out there. So maybe many of you RDPs are here because of things that you've heard from owners. But DOB, we've provided a service notice. We have the EnergyStar Portfolio Manager Local Law 97 reference guide. That's where that table 2.1 is from. These examples and the case study. On our website is that detailed conversion methodology report, which was peer reviewed by the Department of Energy, Lawrence Berkeley National Labs, as well as the EPA EnergyStar Portfolio Manager members of their teams. So you could see details of the conversion methodology. We have a building news and sustainability newsletter, so you could subscribe to those and get updates about. I mentioned earlier when we were looking at that timeline that there's further rulemaking coming, so there'll be more specifics on guidance around submissions. You'll be able to see that as soon as that happens by subscribing to these newsletters. We have our website, our DOB website. There'll be links coming up, but we have a sustainable buildings website, and then there's also information on the DOB, the buildings website, under the sustainability page. We've done email blasts to our owners of the covered buildings list. We've done trainings, or this is one of them. There'll be more. And we have these partnerships, Urban Green, the Building Energy Exchange, the New York City Accelerator, the Sustainability Help Center, AIA, ACEC, REBNY, and so on, just to name a few. And once again, the Rule 103-14 and the rules of the City of New York, Rule 1, Chapter 100, Subchapter C. Don't worry about all that. You could just click on the link, but that's where it is, the rules. And there's others forthcoming. And we've done targeted outreach to impacted properties, and that's a result of that effects on the conversion. Those circular charts we saw where we talked about buildings shifting from one status to another, potentially, because this is based on the data as reported, and the conversion using that data as the way to set the calculations on the equivalent uses. So because of the switch of compliance, we've done targeted outreach. The buildings department, other entities of the city, and perhaps some of you RDPs are here because owners have reached out to you because they're on this list of impacted properties or from this outreach. So those are just, an idea of the things that we've done and the things that we're going to continue to do. And so here are some resources. This is the Building Energy Exchange. They have a LL97 emissions calculator. The link is the top link is the landing page, and there's some shorthand here: ESPM and BC EnergyStar Portfolio Manager BC building code. That's not what it says on their website. That's just making the acronym, the shorthand based on what we've talked about today. If you go to their calculator off their landing page, the link in the middle, you'll see the compliance periods shown based on all the limits, emissions factors published in our rule. You'll see it all the way out to 2050. And this calculator allows you to pull in your local ID4 benchmarking data from the last couple of years. You got to search. There's a search box. It's case sensitive. All of that is described there. So just be aware. You can then import that, and then you can look at it and see where you are. So it does those calculations to figure out your actual annual emissions, and then it compares it to the calculations like we did just before of calculating your building emissions limit, and it uses the 60 property types that are in our reference guide and the rule. It uses those 60 property types as the categorization system. So if you're using the tool, you can manually adjust the settings. You can change the property types and the floor areas associated with each one. It imports your local, and so it's imported from your local ID4 data. So it's using what was reported, and you can modify the inputs on energy and then see how that changes your emissions. In essence, you could do some scenario planning. You can just get familiar. If this is not something you're very familiar with yet, it's a great way to get started. And then also great on Building Energy Exchange is to provide the original calculator, which was published more than a year ago, I believe, which uses the building code system. It has the 10 building code categories that we saw that we looked at in that table from Article 320. And so then you can just do a side-by-side comparison. It doesn't have this, it looks a little bit different. And it doesn't pull as an automated feature the benchmarking data from all the different years. I think it does it from 1 year. If I'm not mistaken, but you can then manually input the numbers and do a side-by-side comparison. So this is something, in essence, you could recreate what we just did in the case study, but for your building, for your property, for different buildings in your portfolio. You can do a side-by-side comparison and just see how the calculations of your building emissions limit change between the two systems. So it's a great tool. It's a great resource to get started. And, here, if you have questions that we don't get to today, so after I get through a couple more slides, if we don't get to some questions, here's our email address. Once again, please email us. Other resources, the New York City Accelerator. So if you're an owner on this call, you can contact the accelerator and be connected with technical support. They'll be able to help you understand incentive programs and so on. Once again, our rule 103.14, the star of the show, if you will, what we've been talking about a lot, the EnergyStar Portfolio Manager property types, our New York City Sustainable Buildings webpage, where everything we talked about is on that page. So the methodology report on the conversion, the advisory board report is there, that the reference guide for EnergyStar, it's there, and the last link here, the covered buildings list. So that's also on our Sustainable Buildings website. So everything that we've talked about is there. So every resource you need to really understand all the details that are available are on our website. The covered building list, once again, it's 27,000 BBLs, around 48,000 buildings, but it's 40% of our carbon in the city of New York. So major opportunity and responsibility for us to be able to make our city more sustainable. So a huge impact to get us to that carbon neutral 80 by 50 goal. So, a lot of important work ahead of us, and, some final logistics. Here you go. Please submit your course evaluation, and then a certificate, if you requested one initially, will be provided. This concludes our presentation. Thank you all. We'll have some time for questions if you want to stick around.
Okay, so Tarek, the first question comes from Marianne Siri. You gave the calculations for the limit, but how do we know what the actual emissions are?
I think, oh, that's a great question. We didn't cover that in detail today. It's described in our rule. In essence, it's the building's utility bills are used. So if your electric multiplied by an emissions coefficient, it's in the law. Certain common fuels are in our Article 320 emissions coefficients, and then in the rule there's other emissions coefficients. So in essence, electricity multiplied by the emissions coefficient will 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 result in a tons of carbon of CO2 equivalent for that given energy type, and then so on. So if your building is then also uses natural gas, it's your natural gas multiplied by the coefficients. The units of measure are there, so it's important to take the utility bills and do the calculation. So that's in the case study example. There was a number that was just there. We didn't explain how it got there, or I did very verbally quickly. So that's the answer, Marianne. Hopefully that makes it more clear. Work with your RDP, and they'll make sure that the calculation is representing your building.
Okay. We have another question from Amanda. When will DOB do a webinar on the rest of the rules released in October, like discussing the clean DER rules, REC rules, rules for ground up new construction, reporting start dates, etc.?
That's a good question. Well, that's not up to just, well, I'll have to confer with my colleagues about that, though there's no firm date on all of that. There's still work being done on developing the rules, but those are important questions, and we will give you those answers. There'll be trainings on those. That's why it's important to go to our website, sign up for the newsletters, and you'll be alerted as soon as the next one of these is happening, when a rule is published or in draft form and then published, and so on. So good question. Thank you.
Okay, I don't see any additional questions. We will hold the chat open for a few more minutes. If someone would like to post a question, we will do our best to answer it. Okay, Daniel Alter is asking for the email slide again. Can you please put that up? It's also posted in the chat. Okay, we have another question. If we are a rent stabilized building, what emissions factor do we follow? I believe that question was also answered in the chat.
Yeah. Check the chat, but there's Article 321 covers rent regulated buildings, so I'd have to look at the question myself to just be sure what it's referring to. But if you confer with an RDP, that's one thing that could help. Article 320 is what we covered today. Article 321 has prescriptive measures for certain buildings. It's defined there. So I would consult those things first, and hopefully that will help. And if it's not clear, email us at our GHG emissions email.
Okay, when will the city decide whether offsets generated outside of New York City, for example, New York State, are allowed in the first period?
So something like offsets would be part of future rulemaking. So that's definitions or clarifications or further detail on submission procedures will be in the future rules. So more information around RECs would be available in that future rulemaking, which is all happening this year. So, stay tuned and sign up for our newsletter.
Okay, then Edward Pacnia says some buildings use additional electricity for ancillary use, such as antenna and server rooms. How do we address this use?
Not being familiar with the details, I don't want to say for certain. Work with an RDP for sure, but just in general, energy associated with the building's use should be reported for local law 97 compliance. That's just sort of a general sort of way to look at it, but there are certain things in our rule and service notices that talk about how calculations and things are deducted. So that specifically, I'd have to confer with colleagues and we'd have to get back to you on more details. So perhaps follow up at our GHG emissions email, and then we could look at some of the details that you might be able to provide to help us understand the situation. But thank you for that.
Okay, and also, Doran, can you please put your question into the chat? I see that your hand is raised. Okay, and we have one more question. Omar Ghazali, does the calculation of emission based on buildings utility bill include the emission due to production of energy from the plant?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm 100% clear what is the plant we're talking about, but there are things. The rule 103.14 describes calculating emissions for, let's say, some sort of a plant that's generating electric or other energy types. Natural gas to electric and things like that. So it shows how the step-by-step formula to calculate your emissions when you're using certain different energy sources to generate other types of energy. So, thinking of like a cogeneration plant, or maybe a plant, maybe that's what you're referring to. But I don't want to try to answer in too much detail because not being familiar with the details of your situation. So look at Rule 103.14, see if that helps. If it's not clear, email us once again. But just in essence, your energy bills, your utility bills that you use for your building, day-to-day uses, you use those as inputs into a calculation. The utility bill data, your energy inputs, and then times a coefficient, emissions coefficient will equal the emissions associated with that energy use in that building. So that's just a general way of looking at it. If that's not helpful, please look at the rule and then email us if it's still not what you're trying to figure out. But thank you for that.
Omar, if you're speaking about Con Ed, that's taken into account for the electricity coefficient. Okay, this is the last question. Can a building use TOU calculations, time of use calculations, if they lower the building carbon footprint? Does Con Ed provide time of use energy use data, or does a building need a BMS?
Oh, there's a lot in a lot of things in that question to potentially answer. I'll just say, because go to the rule. The time of use is there. The details of the calculation. The department will be providing more guidance on the TOU methodology, or how to use the TOU methodology, I should say. So where the information will come from as far as like the grid factor, the grid emissions for time of use. That's something that we'll clarify upcoming. But as far as the building itself, I don't know if a BMS is the only thing that you could do the job, but you would need something to get the information of what the building is actually doing in reference to the grid. So maybe that's very generic, so and not clear enough for you. But go to the rule, start there. If it doesn't help answer get you started, then follow up at our email, because the rule has a lot of information, and then there will be more detail coming from the department.
Okay, I think we have to stop our questions now. Any questions that we haven't gotten to in the chat, we will provide at a later time with a copy of the presentation on our website. And Doran, your hand is still raised. If you still wish to ask a question, please put it in the chat, and we will leave the chat open for a few more minutes, and we will include those in the responses that we give at a later date. Thank you.
Sorry about that, everyone. So hopefully you can see my screen now. Good morning. Hopefully you can see my screen now. So welcome. Good morning.